Spirits remembered are not spirits dead. Now in this peaceful place I pause to name each man who fell unknown, each man who bled his way to glory. Theirs was not the shame, but driven by some inner source of pride, each must have known while dying in this lee, his sacrifice would somehow fit the wide and widening pattern of a destiny. How cold that other March time must have been, how bleak those wooded fields in the attack. I stand now where 1,000 nameless men laid down their lives in war, and looking back, I know I must remember. I must give a name to every one, that he may live.
In 1861, Missouri had played host to one of the first battles of the American Civil War. Confederate forces sent a Northern army reeling that summer near a sleepy little creek outside Springfield. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was the second major land engagement of the Civil War. Yet it was but a big production of the small skirmishes that had been raging along the Kansas-Missouri border since the mid-1850s. Kansas and Missouri sat across from the other like two snarling dogs. Missouri, a slave state, had before the war hoped to see the Kansas Territory become a slaveholding ally. Many Kansans actually transplanted New England abolitionists weren't for it. The result was bloodshed. In the late 1850s, land on both sides of the Kansas-Missouri border became a battleground of sorts. Homes were burned, parties were bushwhacked, and murder and atrocity abounded. Washington politics intervened as Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state. This move closely culminated with the election of Abraham Lincoln to the White House. States from across the South, mainly in defiance of Lincoln's election, immediately began to secede from the Union. The Civil War was out of the plains and hills of Kansas and Missouri, where it had been first fought. Civil war had spread like a disease across the nation. '1861 was a bad year for Northern armies. The Federal defeats at Bull Run, Virginia and Wilson's Creek, Missouri seemed to prove the myth that one Southerner could whip 12 Yankees. And nowhere did this seem more true than in Missouri. The Show-Me State was important to both sides. The North could ill afford a major Confederate stronghold on the borders of Kansas, Iowa, and Illinois. Accordingly, the South could ill afford Union control of St. Louis and its subsequent use as a base of operations for attacks down the Mississippi River. Missouri's fate would be played out with two armies and one very important battle. By February 1862, the long struggle for Missouri had but one more month. He arrived directly from Richmond, Major General Earl Van Dorn, the new commander of the Confederate Army of the West. The former West Pointer had been third on the list for the job, and very soon he would prove why. During his route to join the consolidated commands of Price and McCulloch, he came down with a fever. The illness would make him near bedridden throughout the Pea Ridge Campaign, but Van Dorn seemed ridden with something more, a tendency to do the impulsive. He liked the speed and surprise tactics he'd used fighting Indians on the Texas plains. He saw no reason why they wouldn't work in Arkansas. It prompted him to begin his push to capture St. Louis in the dead of winter, with little thought to strategy and even less thought to the logistics of supplies and moving thousands of men through rough Ozark roads. Van Dorn's impulsiveness would lead to his downfall at Pea Ridge. Van Dorn unified the commands of Missourian Sterling Price and Texan Ben McCulloch in what he hoped would unify the two Western generals. A feud had festered between the men from the war's onset. The feud was political and very personal. The two men had settled their disputes for one day last August when they joined to defeat a federal force at Wilson's Creek, Missouri. But after the battle, they continued their battle. Yet again, they'd be forced to put their differences aside. Van Dorn's new Army of the West was breaking winter quarters and heading forward to St. Louis. The Army of the West would spend the winter of 1862 on their feet. The Federal Army of the Southwest had one purpose when it left St. Louis in the winter of 1862: to destroy Sterling Price's Missouri Army. This was the third attempt to destroy Price, who'd been hailed across the South last fall after capturing a federal garrison at Lexington, Missouri. The former Missouri governor had pushed hard at the war's onset for Missouri neutrality in the coming struggle, but the early federal military grip on the state drove Sterling Price into Confederacy. And now he had around 10,000 troops wintering in Springfield, keeping 120,000 federal troops occupied across the state of Missouri. The eyes of Washington were on newly appointed Federal General Samuel Curtis to put an end to this embarrassment. Curtis was a West Pointer and a former Iowa congressman who'd raised a regiment in his state when the war began. He would become the most successful Union commander in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. And it all began on February 10, 1862, as his troops left Rolla, Missouri to find Price and destroy him. Price didn't wait long to react. 3 days later, he had abandoned his winter quarters outside Springfield. Union soldiers began calling the Confederate Missourians Price's pedestrians. Throughout the month of February, the two armies would clash as Curtis closes on Price's heels as the two armies enter Arkansas. Skirmishes and some full-fledged battles erupt as Price hurries for the Boston Mountains, where he will rendezvous with McCulloch's army. But Price's pedestrians will turn and fight. Curtis knows it. By late March, he's entrenched in northwest Arkansas along a little-known rise called Pea Ridge. Curtis had dug in well at Little Sugar Creek. A Confederate attack from the south would not penetrate his well-defended line. Van Dorn knew it, too. After a constant and withering two-day march, Van Dorn continues to drive his army. He will strike Curtis's rear. To accomplish this, Van Dorn's weary army must march around the Federals. It meant 18 solid hours marching with little to eat and no time to sleep. The Confederate Army of the West was near total exhaustion.
Such a worn-out set of men I never saw. It seemed as if General Van Dorn imagined the men were made of cast steel, with the strength and powers and endurance of a horse. Scarcely time was given the men to prepare food and snatch a little rest.
The former Indian fighter had never dealt with the logistics of moving thousands of men and animals. Consequently, by dawn, Van Dorn's army was strung out for miles, behind Curtis's Federal line. On the morning of March 7, 1862, Union troops spotted movement behind their lines along an old farm road known as Ford Road. Earlier that morning, Federal troops had heard the unmistakable rumble of artillery wheels in the distance. This movement was McCullough's Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas troops. Earlier that morning, realizing that his army could never be united in time for a single strike, Van Dorn divides it. These 16,000 men, who in a moment rare in the Civil War actually outnumber the Union Army, will hit Curtis at 2 points. 3 Federal cannon opened on McCullough's Confederate column just entering the field. Today, the South would attack from the north, and here near Leetown, Arkansas, the Battle of Pea Ridge had begun.
In every direction I could see my comrades falling. Officers tried to rally the men, but order gave way to confusion. The scene baffles description.
Federal soldiers at Leetown were also baffled by 2,500 screaming Cherokee Indians under the command of Confederate Albert Pike, a very unusual sight during the Civil War. The Cherokee Nation had officially seceded from the Union and represented themselves for the Confederate States of America at Pea Ridge, successfully taking a Union battery before being driven off. It was the only action they would see over the next 2 days. After early Confederate attacks were repelled, General McCullough decides to organize the next advance himself. The former Texas Ranger advanced alone to survey the Federal line. 70 yards away, a Federal skirmisher of the 36th Illinois drew a bead. Instantly, with a single shot through the head, the Confederate commander was dead. With McCullough's death, command fell to his immediate subordinate, James McIntosh. But another Federal round ball quickly ended his military career. Other Confederate officers in the chain of command were nowhere to be found. The Confederate advance at Leetown, without a clear leadership, stalled. Some Confederate troops, in fact, were plain lost. Rebels under Colonel Louis Hebert, unfurling the Confederate battle flag in action for the first time in the Trans-Mississippi, were amongst the dense Arkansas hickory and oaks in an area known to locals as Morgan's Woods. In these woods, the fighting had been tangled, bloody, and confused. Indiana troops had advanced into the Smoky Woods and literally collided with Hebert's Confederates. Their misdirected advance actually severed Hebert's contact with the Confederate line. With McCullough and McIntosh dead, the Louisiana commander was now the ranking Confederate officer at Leetown, though he didn't know it. Lost and confused, Hebert and large numbers of his men would eventually be captured as they stumbled into the Federal line. Van Dorn's two-pronged attack plan was rapidly failing. McCullough was dead and his command in retreat. Yet Van Dorn would not get the bad news for hours. General Price's Missourians, advancing up the Telegraph Road into the dense forested valley known as Cross Timber Hollow, still expected to link up with McCullough. But now, the burden of a Confederate victory at Pea Ridge would rest upon these Missourians.
The boys were eager to get into battle with Curtis, thinking they would drive him back and then we could return to Missouri.
These words echo the sentiment of many Missourians orphaned from their home state. For many of the men of Price's Missouri Brigade, 41 months would pass before they stepped foot on home soil again. Most wouldn't be that lucky. Much of the Battle of Pea Ridge occurred around and along a route called the Telegraph Road, dubbed for the line that paralleled it throughout Missouri and Arkansas. The road was the 19th century equivalent of an interstate. Throughout the war, it carried thousands of soldiers, north and south, to victories and defeats. In 1858, the Butterfield stage line popularized the road by running mail twice a week from St. Louis to San Francisco. Immediately, a slew of inns and stables opened along the route to accommodate the heavy traffic. One such place was Elkhorn Tavern, nestled a few miles south of the Missouri border, accented with huge elk antlers upon its roof. The tavern would become a focal point of the Battle of Pea Ridge. In its lawn, men from both sides would be wounded. Within its walls, some of them would die. At 10:30 a.m., General Curtis had Leetown on his mind, until a messenger brought the news he'd been waiting for all morning. A large body of Confederate infantry were moving toward his center, but not up the Little Sugar Creek Valley from the south as he'd expected. Instead, along Telegraph Road from the north, behind his army. Curtis had been sending Federal soldiers into the Leetown engagement all morning. He was beginning to win there. In 6 hours, he will turn the rest of his army superbly around, like a big, very long gate. Curtis did have one thing in his favor up north on Telegraph Road. Today, Confederate General Van Dorn was lacking the two elements he'd built his reputation on: speed and surprise. Van Dorn had accompanied the Missouri contingent of the Army of the West on their northern trek around the Union Army. His 8,000 Missourians, through exhaustion and straggling, now number 5,000. The Missourians advanced south on Telegraph Road up the rough incline of Pea Ridge. They'd moved for 2 miles through the woods, undetected. They're hungry, on the verge of collapse, but still ready to fight. Yet Van Dorn orders Price to move forward with caution. It will give Curtis enough time to build a brief defense at Elkhorn Tavern. Some still claim it gave him enough time to build his victory. In these woods, Iowa and Illinois farm boys were again meeting their Missouri neighbors. The dense forest hid real distances and the foe. The fighting at times became very close, too close. Confederate artillery outnumbered the Federals nearly 7-1.
The smoke from the guns settled like a cloud upon the field, and an hour up to the beginning of the engagement, the position of the enemy's cannon was oftentimes only to be ascertained by the dull red flash at the moment of discharge.
We stood at the tempest of death. I believe every man at the guns had made up his mind to die there, for it did not seem possible any of us could get out alive.
Suddenly, something like a tremendous peal of thunder opened along our front, and then a ridge of fire and smoke appeared close before us. The trees round us and over our heads rattled with the bullets as if in a heavy hailstorm.
Serious gaps had developed within the Federal line, but the thick woods and even thicker smoke hid these gaps and the real secrets of the Federal defense. They were desperately outnumbered, their line was short, and their ammunition train had been moved south to avoid Confederate artillery fire. Despite reinforcements, the Federal defense at Elkhorn Tavern was crumbling. Price had extended his line as it moved forward, and it was paying off. Very soon it would overlap the Federals. He was also taking advantage of the other road that ran to Elkhorn Tavern from the east, the Huntsville Road. Missouri State Guardsmen were steadily honing in on the exposed right side of the Federal line. Many Federals were amazed at the Confederates coming out of the brush dressed in what they called burial clothes. The white-clad Missourians had been issued these odd uniforms, their first ever only a month ago. The undyed jean wool resembled burial shrouds at a distance. To many Missourians, it was a deadly omen. Veterans wrote that the fighting here in Cross Timbers and around Elkhorn Tavern was some of the worst they saw throughout the war.
Such a yell they crossed that field with, you never heard.
The battery opened on us with a sweeping fire, tearing through our lines, crashing amongst the limbs of the trees, and scattering the rocks in the air, now filled with contents of bursted shells. Like a withering, scorching blast, the torrent of lead and iron poured through the surrounding smoke.
Strange to say, I heard the bullet strike him with a thud. He was so near me that he almost brushed me as he fell. He threw up his hands and said, "Oh Lord," and was dead.
The fighting swirled on all parts of the battle line. Ground lost was quickly regained, with a heavy toll. Price's troops withstood horrendous Yankee musket fire before a Federal counterattack finally stopped the Missourians. But Curtis's Federals lacked the firepower to produce a victory. Van Dorn's exhausted Confederates could go no further. The Army of the West had reached its peak in the Trans-Mississippi theater of the war. Van Dorn had failed to consolidate his men. Consequently, his numerical superiority went unused as his army fought at two separate parts of the battlefield. As the sun fell March 7, 1862, so did the chances of Confederate possession of Missouri and Arkansas. Though they'd lost ground and were outnumbered at almost every part of the field, Curtis's Federals had fought well all day. The Yankee general was undaunted. His last words before retiring that night, March 7th, were, "In the morning I will attack at Elkhorn Tavern and will whip the rebels there. When I whip them there, I whip them everywhere." The darkness hid the dead and dying scattered amongst the brush along Pea Ridge. The tavern was now a hospital. Over 60 wounded and dying men crowded its 2 floors. More waited outside in the cold. Adequate medical supplies were lacking within both armies. Amputations continued throughout the night. The Federal Army of the Southwest spent the night preparing and massing. By the morning, March 8th, ammunition was resupplied. Some units received a food ration, and most importantly, Curtis now had his entire 10,000-man army together and ready to strike. General Van Dorn awoke that morning to find his fever gone. The day looked like it might even get warm, but his luck would end there. He begins to reorganize the scrambled lines of men who'd collapsed in their places when the battle ended the day before. He'd also consolidated his troops. Colonel Elkanah Greer, now in command of McCullough's division, had marched the battered Leetown veterans all night to Elkhorn Tavern. The Army of the West is reunited, unfortunately a day late, and without one vital element it must have to win today. Van Dorn's supply train is miles away at Camp Stevens. The supply train with the desperately needed ammunition and food is unreachable, and Van Dorn doesn't know it yet. Federal batteries had boldly deployed in the fields facing the Confederate battle line. They were feeling for a weakness. Confederate guns responded, quickly driving the Federal cannon to the cover of the woods. With this new breath of confidence, Van Dorn launches a Confederate attack. It immediately comes under fire from other Federal batteries. The attack ends as quickly as it had begun. Today, Curtis would finally be able to rely on his second in command, Franz Sigel. The German-born Federal general held a string of military failures, yet his political popularity kept him in command. He also possessed a fine reputation with his troops. Today, he would lead them in his finest day of the war. Van Dorn's infantry lined the edge of a farmer's field in the security of heavy forest. Very soon, no amount of trees would be sufficient cover. Curtis gives Sigel the go-ahead. The German quickly deploys his 2 divisions and personally oversees artillery fire, pinpointing Confederate batteries, one at a time. 21 Federal guns begin to hone in on individual Confederate cannon, inciting a 2-hour artillery bombardment. For 120 minutes, Federal guns would fire one shot every 2 seconds. It was, at that time, the largest artillery barrage of the war.
Such a cyclone of fallen timber and busting shells, I don't suppose was ever equaled during our great war.
It was a continual thunder, and a fellow might have believed that the day of judgment had come. It was the grandest thing I ever saw or thought of.
Confederate units within the woods took a severe beating as the Federal guns occasionally overshot their targets. Troops on the right side of the Confederate line began to run away from the battle. Amazingly, Van Dorn only uses 3 of his 15 available batteries during the bombardment, and these 3 were ineffective. The true dilemma was the lack of ammunition. Most of it was with the supply train, miles away at Camp Stevens. Van Dorn finally realizes his army's peril. They must retreat quickly or risk total annihilation. Sigel's blue infantrymen had most of the Confederates on the run. Van Dorn orders a general withdrawal. He intends to march completely around the Federal army and regroup near the Boston Mountains. As he begins to pull off of Pea Ridge, he leaves a handful of Missourians to face Sigel's 2 Federal divisions. Sigel, for the first time in his military career, was winning.
On the right end of line, double quick. Lord, but how we made things hum. Forward, quick time, guide right. March on an open space. Halt, make ready, take aim, fire. After first shot, load at will. Our guns are booming. The battery howling, wounded, groaning, some excited, I might say all, but we was going forward.
That beautiful charge I shall never forget, with banners streaming, with drums beating, and our long line of bluecoats advancing upon the double quick, with their deadly bayonets gleaming in the sunlight, and every man and foot officer yelling at the top of his lungs. The rebel yell was nowhere in comparison.
Missouri Brigade soldiers fought desperately to protect the Confederate retreat and paid for it. This unit would go on to become known as the South's finest. Pea Ridge was their first proving ground. Many Confederates thought they were moving to a new battle position. Communication throughout the retreat was weak. Units splintered in all directions as Sigel's Federals closed in. The Confederate Army of the West seemingly vanished from Pea Ridge. One Southern officer said that Van Dorn and Price will have to get out a search warrant to find their army. Federal soldiers stopped the pursuit to celebrate their incredible victory. They'd faced superior numbers, beat an enemy who'd snuck up behind them, and typical of most Civil War armies, were content to do no more. Van Dorn's Confederates experienced one of the worst marches of the war en route to the Boston Mountains. Their stay was brief. By the middle of March, they were again on the road, crossing the Mississippi River to assist in the fight for the Middle South. By leaving Arkansas, Van Dorn stripped the Trans-Mississippi of its largest Confederate fighting force and gave up Confederate possession of Missouri and Arkansas for the remainder of the war. Curtis would take the initiative and occupy Little Rock as Union military governor of the state. The victory at Pea Ridge set the stage for other important northern triumphs in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Pea Ridge was also integral in weakening the Confederate springtime morale in 1862. Curtis's Army of the Southwest achieved one of the largest victories of the war, though its status in the annals of history rarely give it such credence. Van Dorn died before the war ended, not in battle, but at the hands of a jealous husband. The loss at Pea Ridge rested on his shoulders. A Missouri brigadier general put it best: nobody was whipped at Pea Ridge but Van Dorn.